Let's look at global food supply now. Transport restrictions have stopped farmers exporting and resulted in excess food production in some parts. Some countries, farmers are finding it difficult to get food to market and the food is simply going to waste. Is that happening here in South Africa? Well, let's find out. We're joined by Wandile Sihlobo, Chief Economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. Good evening, Wandile. Thank you very much for joining us. Reading an article in The Guardian, it says that the COVID clampdowns are really destroying some of the supply chains in the United States. Food that was meant to go to restaurants and schools and big events is just absolutely going to waste. Is that happening in South Africa?
Good evening. We are fortunate in South Africa because we're not experiencing that scale. What we've become to realize is that the amount of food that is consumed in the restaurant in South Africa is not as big as what you would see in the United States, whereby if you look at their annual consumption of food, the figures between 15 to 20% is what is consumed in the restaurants. And with those being closed, that's the consequence that we are seeing now. But fortunately in South Africa, I think that number, that percentage is pretty much small. And also some of the portion of the food have been able to be moved to the formal retail chain. And now people are replacing that through the groceries.
Yes, I was wondering about the redistribution factor. I was also reading that globally there's a glut of milk because the coffee shops are all closed, but it's probably the same situation. We have far fewer coffee shops than proportionally than other countries. But what about things like food for the school feeding schemes, food for food parcels, the fact that people's shopping habits have probably changed? We heard about people stockpiling on flour and yeast, worried about bread supply. Has that all been sort of carefully managed so that we don't have any real problems? I certainly don't see empty shelves.
Yeah, I think on a supply perspective, it is somewhat carefully managed. And I think the government also have been pretty much more generous on the agricultural side by not putting as strict measures as what we see in the other sectors. So we've been able to operate, although not at optimal level. But I think, though, the downfall of those feeding schemes not being there is really on the hunger side for children that are coming from households that are less fortunate. So that's where I think even some of the measures that are being put up, like the food vouchers and all of those things, will assist on easing up pressure there. But certainly on the supply chain side, it hasn't been that much of a factor, but worries from the household food security side.
Do you expect to see an increase in the price of wheat in the coming months? And I ask this because we import half of our wheat, and we know that globally those supply chains have been constrained and there have been problems. Are you anticipating that perhaps the price of wheat in South Africa may go up because of the global position?
I think that the wheat crop is one of the ones that is largely more on a political side, even on a global market, because while a number of countries, you take, for example, Russia, have been putting up export quotas, limitations of how much they could sell to the market, that doesn't really justify the level of supplies that we see there. For example, in 2019-20 production season, global wheat production is up 6%, over 760 million tons. So there is a lot of wheat to go around. But I think what countries that are largely wheat producers are doing, they worried because they're not sure for how long will the pandemic last. And now they are starting to place controls on how much wheat they put in the market. So if that continues for longer, it could have implications on the wheat prices. By virtue of that, that could be translated on a local market. But to your question of do I anticipate increase in bread prices in South Africa, I'll say in the near term, no, in a sense that we've already imported nearly half of what we would import, which is about a year we would import this time around about 1.8 million tons. Half of that we already landed on our shores. And also the fact that when we look at the numbers that are coming up pointing to the 2020-21 production season, countries like Russia, Ukraine, and the US are looking at good numbers. So my sense is that they might pull back from expressing control over exports. And if that gets to be the issue, therefore the increases we've seen on wheat prices would be viewed more as a temporary blip, and then things could neutralize. But we're watching closely to see how things turn out.
We're about to move to level 4 as a country, but one industry that stayed open right through, of course, is farming and agriculture. How well have they adapted to the new measures around wearing masks and that sort of thing? It's a little bit of a foretaste of what other businesses are going to have to go through. Have they been managing well? Have staff been available?
Yeah, I think we've been managing relatively well if one looks at what has been, and also the fact that farming on its own is really by nature social distancing because we're operating outside of the cities, less crowded areas, and I think that offers some bit of a system. But during the harvesting time, obviously those gets to be a busy time, but we've consistently in conversation with our members and various farmers to ensure that they place the health regulations that in place, because if we don't follow the health regulations, we'll experience what the US is experiencing, for example. If you look across the United States, a number of plants in Canada as well as in South America, particularly Brazil, are shutting down on a meat side because of the coronavirus that is now contaminated some of the food industries. So in South Africa, we've been fortunate. We're not seeing those cases. And I think if we maintain the high health standards as we proceed with the food production, we'll be able to do well. But so far, I think things are moving relatively better.
Well, that is very encouraging news. Thank you so much. That's Wandile Sihlobo. He's the Chief Economist for the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa.